Brilliant, thanks a million. Look, there's not going to be an emergency. We all know this. If there was going to be one, it would have been when Aingeala and I walked into a church and neither of us burst into flames. So I think we've done well so far, and everything else is going to be fantastic. Thank you so much for coming out so early on a Saturday morning. I would say it's lovely to be back in Wexford, but I spent my summer holidays in Wexford this year, so I've actually been in Wexford more than in Dublin in the last 3 weeks, so it kind of feels like normality here. Aingeala, I was going to do a load of other things, but let's do the John McGahern Prize first, because it's the most recent one. And, you know, Colm Tóibín has picked that. And Colm tends not to, you know, he's very specific about the things that he loves. What was that like when you got the phone call / email / whatever?
Well, I knew for a couple of weeks, but I mean, you're really not allowed to tell anyone. Like, I got the impression that they might take it away if I told somebody, you know, and so I wasn't. So I told my son and told him that I'd give him money if he didn't tell anyone, because I had to tell somebody, you know, and so that was fine. And then I was doing, you know, Colm is the laureate for Irish fiction at the moment, and so he has this the Art of Reading fiction book club. And so I'll be featured in November with the Amusements. So I had to record that with him a couple of weeks ago down in Cork in Hollyhill Library. And we went for lunch beforehand, and I had to wait until the Arts Council person went away from the table. And I was like, can I? And he was like, oh, you know. And we're like, you know. So we had this really quick conversation for about 20 seconds, and then it was, shh, she's coming back. So it was really lovely. You know, I mean, he's such a dote. He's such a sweet, approachable, intelligent, sensitive, funny person who wears it all so lightly that I was kind of, it was just great to kind of have a giggle and we've got a secret with him, you know. But, and apart from that, obviously I admire him hugely as a writer, and that he chose the book was just such an honour and a privilege.
And he's doing such great things with the laureateship at the moment. His outreach stuff that he's doing and those things that he's doing around the country and talking to other writers are great. Okay, I'll scroll all the way back. Before you were an award-winning published writer, you were a journalist. Tell me a little bit how you got into that, and what was your route into that, and what was your passion that got you initially into journalism in the first place?
Well, I think I always wanted to be a journalist, but I didn't know what it was. You know, there were no journalists in the family. We always had loads of newspapers when I was growing up. There weren't many books in our house, but there were loads of newspapers. My dad was English. My mother's from Mooncoin in South Kilkenny, and I would have been, as a child, I lived in Waterford City. And so we had all the English tabloids, which my mother couldn't stand, but my father loved. And my mother always had the Irish Press and then the Irish Independent in the house. I didn't see the Irish Times until I went to university, never saw it. And then we took the Munster Express, the Kilkenny People. So the house, every week, there'd just be newspaper, and every day, and, you know, I mean, so that was going on and on. So I kind of, I just thought, well, I want to write. And I thought that was how you wrote, that you became somebody who wrote for newspapers. So we lived in Dublin when I was a teenager, so I got a job writing GAA reports for the Clondalkin Echo. My job.
When you say you got, I've read that story before. How does that come about? Do you just rock up to the Clondalkin Echo and go, I'd love to do something, I like the GAA, any chance? What happened?
I mean, this is the early 1980s. Things were different then, you know, stuff just happened. So my dad really got into hurling. He was, you know, a rugby man from Wigan. But when he came here, rugby was a very different thing. Like, rugby wasn't a country thing or a working class thing. So he got into hurling, you know, and he got the GAA eventually kind of accepted this North of England guy who was really into hurling. And so we lived in Clondalkin beside Round Terrace GAA club, which people know because it was Jim Gavin's club. But my father was always more into hurling than football. So he was a mentor and he sponsored a team. So he would have known, you know, everyone there. Lived right beside the GAA club in Clondalkin. But I think my first boyfriend was a fella who was a photographer. Like, he was a teenager, he was in school as well. But he got a job. He was really into photography, taking the photographs for the Clondalkin Echo. And he said, listen, they're looking for someone to write reports and you like writing. I was 14. I mean, it seems unbelievable now, you know. But I was, you know, I was like, you know, sort of fat, bookish 14-year-old. And my brother was doing trials for the Dublin minor hurling team, and my sister was playing camogie, and I just wasn't sporty. So I could write. So I'd sit down, and my dad would say, let me see that. What are you writing?
Was he fact-checking it?
He was my editor.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think your man who owned the paper, who I don't even remember meeting, So I'd forgotten about all of this, and I just didn't, I didn't get into college to study journalism. I wasn't a very good student at third level. So when I was 30, after travelling up until the point I was 30, I went to GCU and did my master's in journalism with a real kind of, okay, this is to work. Like, I was married as an adult at a house that, I'd moved back from living abroad with my husband. And so it had to work. So I really took it seriously and got a job straight away into FM and broadcasting. And then I realised, oh yeah, because I always like I did radio as a present from the time I was 7 or 8 years old, just listening to, Radio 2 kind of came around when I was about 9 years old. So it was like Jimmy Greeley on Sunday afternoon.
Jimmy Greeley.
Here's the thing, I was writing an essay at the moment about music, but you forget about memories. And when I was 11, I was in the Boporama National Disco Dancing Championship, right?
Okay.
Right, and I got to meet Ruth Buchanan.
Oh, now we're talking.
Right.
Oh, wow.
So this was, for some reason, only recently moved from South Kilkenny. We moved quite a bit when I was young, so we were still culties, basically.
Yeah.
So the idea of meeting Ruth Buchanan and Barry Lang was just like, it was like meeting Madonna and Michael Jackson or something, we were really famous people, and there were radio stars. So, it all makes sense in retrospect when you when you kind of follow it through. But anyway, last year, one of my aunts passed away, and at her funeral, another one of my aunts, I've loads of aunts, I was trying to count them this morning with my son. I think I've got, on my mother's side, 9 of them in the family, and they're mostly women. But one of them, anyway, said to me, I've got your first published work. Will I send it to you? And I thought, it must be a restaurant review, or it wasn't it from Duncan Echo? I'd sent it to her.
Nice.
And there were the little clippings. And I said, it's not much, Auntie Nancy, but it's a start. They paid me £25 for each of those. You wouldn't get that now. You wouldn't get that now as a journalist. Yeah.
I think that was more than I got for a week's work in my first radio
Maybe
job.
it was for both of them. But I remember there was a cheque for £25 because it was like, I just signed the back of it because I had no bank account and give it to my father.
Yeah.
And he gave me the money.
You've just given me a flashback, which rarely happens when I'm sitting on stage in front of other people. I think, I'm doing the maths in my head, 7, the year Flash Gordon, the film, came out. And I ended up going to the RDS because there was some, show that was on the RDS, some, whatever it was, house show or, something like that. And the late, great Fat Vinnie Hanley was doing a show there. And I think he played the Queen theme tune to it. And I air guitared it in front of 7-year-old me in the RDS. And he was like in there going, hey, there's a guy there, he's a little kid, he's great, isn't he fantastic? And I think that's the beginning of my path into
Is there archive of that? I'd love to.
There is so not.
Really?
Absolutely not.
Because you know what, I really, so many people, there is archive of them somewhere. Because I was going to, there's no recording of the Boporama, just competition. Thank you. But for years, when I was working in Today FM, the last show that I did there was producing Neil Delamere's Sunday show on Monday morning. That would have been a good one, wouldn't it? On a Sunday morning, and it was a great archive of him. His first television appearance was the winning team on Blackboard Jungle with Ray Darcy.
Nice.
And he was such a quizzer, in his head. He's always throw me questions before we go on air. But that was him in his school uniform. Whatever school he was in, and awfully winning.
Okay, so you did radio for quite some time, both as a producer and as a journalist, and as I read in one of the interviews that you've been talking about that there reached a point then where after you'd had the initial successes with short stories and you'd been through the Irish Writers' Centre, the process there, which is brilliant, by the way. I was a judge in it 1 year, and it brings out just the best in people, the novel fair. You then decided at one point to go, if I'm going to do this seriously, I've got to take it seriously. And you gave up your job. Yeah. And you gave up your job writing as well. Yeah. Was that insane, or was that brave? I mean, in retrospect, it's worked out really well for you. But at the time, what did that feel like?
I knew it was right. I just knew. I had this gut feeling I had to do this. I just had to be brave enough to do it. But I was working for 20 years as a journalist. I was working freelance for the Irish Independent, and I was also lecturing in journalism. So I'm not afraid of freelancing. I've realised, so many people have said this to me, what an incredible thing to do, to give up your staff job in Today FM. I mean, my family are all tradesmen. We're all sole traders. I grew up around people working for themselves, and I was never afraid of it. So I always had a contingency of freelance writing, even though I was staffing Today FM. I really only felt comfortable if I had belt and braces in that way.
Yeah.
So the idea of removing the Today FM part of it, because I really did have to, I mean, I couldn't. Because I knew enough people who were writers that when you get into writing a novel, there is nothing else going on. Like, you're just in a tunnel. And particularly because when I started working doing the Neil's programme, it was different, because it was an entertainment magazine programme. But certainly when I was in the newsroom and The Last Word, you're monitoring the news 24 hours a day. You can't miss anything, And so that, I just knew that I couldn't do the two of them. So that I didn't feel, I mean, people did think, oh, she's having a midlife crisis, I mean, I was in my late 40s. So it was kind of like...
That's a perfect time to have one, apparently.
Apparently it is, yeah. So, no, I knew that I had to do it. Now, if I failed, at least, I'd rather regret something I didn't do, or, you know what I mean, that I tried, than something I never did. So, yeah. And I've been writing for years, so I kind of knew I was all right at it. But that doesn't mean that you're going to get published,
Or that the book is going to be well received, or that the book is going to sell, which it has done.
Mm.
I again, I think maybe in the same interview or in a different one, you had said, somebody had asked you about whether or not you were destined to be an author. It was the phrase that they used. And you talked about the idea of that being kind of entitled and presumptuous, the idea that somebody is destined to be an author. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about thoughts that you have on that, because it's something I agree with.
Oh, I just don't agree with ever telling somebody that's who you are, now stay in your box. That's really offensive to me. Like, that's the most fundamental thing where I just I didn't know anyone who was a writer growing up, but like, it's not just me. I mean, people who've read the book will see class as a big theme in it. But I just really feel that if you've got a talent or an interest, that it should be encouraged in you no matter where you're from. Or you should be allowed to explore it. And that's, that lack of choice, not being able to have the choice to look into it, to look into your talents or to look into your interests, I think is an awful thing to do to a young person in particular. And that's the big theme in the Amusements. Helen doesn't get to be an artist.
Yeah, because it is a class-based thing as well. I've done more than my fair share of events over the last few years with working class writers talking about it is different in the UK. It's far more pronounced in the UK than it is here. But the idea that obviously people who are from a certain sort of background have a greater cushion, which allows them maybe the possibility to find that space to write, or they do grow up in houses where they're surrounded by books, or with parents who work in the arts in one form or another. But for maybe those of us, and I'm one of those people as well, who grew up in a house where it was just old Sunday newspapers, and where you didn't know anybody who was a writer, or the idea of the only people who were writers were, Enid Blyton and, whoever wrote the Hardy Boys books, which I should know at this point. Franklin Dixon, I do know. That's the quizzer in me. But the idea that you could become a writer is only something now that whole maybe conversation is being had about that, it is something that working class voices need to be found, and those stories need to be told.
Well, they do, but I mean, it's not... literature is much poorer if you only have one type of writing in it. And it's not, when people, I find in Dublin, people think when you mean working class, that you mean urban working class. Yeah. I don't mean that at all. I really don't. There's just so many, I just feel everything should be represented. There's stories everywhere. And I don't have any regret that I didn't grow up in a bookish family that was full of people with MAs and doctorates, and that I didn't move in those circles, because I feel like I've got greater social mobility than a lot of my friends who did grow up in that environment. I don't ever feel like a fish out of water in any environment.
And dare I say it, and don't say this out loud, a greater grasp on reality as well, which is handy as you go through life.
Yeah, I don't know about that. That to me is inverted snobbery. Yeah.
Now we're talking. Listen, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for coming along today. Tell me about I did want to ask you as well about the Masters in UCD, specifically because it is a very big deal these days. And it has, not that that's what it's there for, but a very high strike rate of writers who are coming out of that and going on to be published and to be successful, which I think probably says something about the sort of people that they accept onto the Masters in Writing in UCD. You were talking again in something that you'd said about Anne Enright being a part of that and her getting to read your work at that stage. I think you had said that it was special to have her read your work. Some people would find that terrifying.
Yeah.
You obviously didn't. Or did you?
I don't know if that's true, that I didn't find it terrifying. She's a huge influence on my work, and I admire her hugely. So I was the ultimate fangirl going in. I was like, oh my God, here she comes. You know? But I'd met her before, and she didn't remember this, and I wasn't going to remind her of it either. It was in 2007, and she'd just won the Booker. And I'd just had my son, and I went into Today FM, as you do, into your workplace to show off the new baby. You know, and I walked into the floor with the newsroom in the studio. The last word was, and she was sitting there waiting to go into the studio with some junior minister. I don't know who it was, you know, can't remember, but it was definitely a junior minister. I remember that. The baby was being passed around. I saw her and I thought, oh my God, I'd read Making Babies, read her memoir about having a baby and about Holles Street and all of this. And I had a very difficult labour. I was in labour for 2 days, you know. The baby was 15 days overdue. It wasn't fun. And, but every book that I'd read about having a baby was all such a load of crap. It was rubbish. They were lying, you know. And I thought, I'm actually going to die, except for Anne Enright told the truth. You know, her book was so actually and I was like, I'm not. This is exactly what Anne Enright. So I went up to her while she was sitting outside the green room, and I was like, your book saved my life. She's like, who is this crazy woman? And I was like, oh my God, Anne, I had no idea. I thought I was going to die. But you know the bit where you go in and all the women are screaming and pulling the curtains? And I was like, that was me. I was that woman. And she's like, okay. And of course she's thinking, I better get my stuff together to talk to Matt Cooper about the gathering.
Yeah.
And so, no, that wasn't enough. I had to go on and say to her, like, 2 epidurals, a episiotomy. They wouldn't tell me how many stitches, Anne. And the guy beside her just got up, took his notes and just walked away, like, out into another. And she was kind of, and then eventually the producer came and caught me kind of by my elbow.
The junior minister is like, this is not part of my brief.
Yeah, well, maybe it was. I can't remember which one it was. But I never told her that. And she launched the Amusements. And at the launch, I thought, now's the time. And she was sitting in the front row going, that was you. Yeah. So I didn't tell her while we were there. But look, you know, there was 5 of us in the class. And Sarah Gill Martin was in my class. And Aoife Fitzpatrick was in my class. And both, I mean, Sarah's on her 2nd novel now. And Aoife published her 1st one this year. And Nydia Ariep, who's a poet, was in our class, and she's published with Penguin as well. So all of us, basically, you know, I think it was a particular chemistry with that group of people, and I don't think you can predict it. The course is great, and there's really good people teaching on it, and obviously Anne is the professor there. But it's a dynamic where you're sharing work and everyone is ambitious and competitive, but in a really good, encouraging way. You'd be reading Sarah's work or Aoife's work in my case, because they were the novelists and the fiction writers. And I would just think, oh my God, they're so good. I have to be better next week. I have to be better next week, you know? Because it kind of was like you were letting the side down. It felt like a team effort. It was great. Like, we're still friends and we still, you know, support each other and all of that. So yeah, it's a great... And Anna's very... She's a very funny woman, very funny. And that was what I couldn't get over in the class. She'd be reading through, she only read my stuff maybe 3 or 4 times. We didn't have it for that long, but she'd be close reading it. And I remember this one thing, like in the Amusements scene where Helen is remembering being a child and she gets on the bus in Tramore to go to Waterford. And I had the bus belching or something, I don't know. And no, it wasn't. It was when the bus starts. I had it rumbling or grumbling. And she was going, what year is this? And I was like, oh, I don't know. And she goes, oh, you have to know what year it is. I was like, oh, okay. I said, well, maybe 1980. She's like, okay. She said, what kind of buses did they have? And I was like, how the hell do I know? You know? And she's going, you have to find out what the bus is like. You need to know what engine, what make a bus it is, what kind of engine it is. And then you need to go online and see if you can find someone with that engine and what sound it makes.
Yeah.
And I was going, God, she's a tyrant. That's the forensic level of detail. But she was very funny about it. And I used to leave and I'd be on my way home from UCD and I'd realise that she totally torn me asunder. I'd be roaring laughing in my head about, oh, and then she said, oh, she's so great. And then she said, and I was like, oh God, she actually was kind of tearing it asunder. Not tearing it asunder, she was never unkind, but she was just so humorous about it. But that was the level of detail. And when you have somebody who's a master, you know, you go, okay, that's how you get to be that good, because every single thing has to be interrogated. Everything.
Because sometimes there is nothing worse than reading a book that you are really enjoying and you are very much into, and there's a tiny detail that just yanks you out of it, and you go, oh, and it can be something incredibly simple like that, or incredibly be stupid. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me. 100%.
I mean, I had it during the summer. It was a guy, he was a good friend with who I played tennis with, doing building work in my house, and he used to be a butcher. He used to be a craft butcher, and of course there was a butcher in the Amusements, and he said to me, John, I really love your book, it's great. And I looked, the butcher, where'd you get the idea? He's a butcher, he's great. And I said, he said, just one thing now, I mean, it's not criticism. And I was like, oh, here we go. And he said, you know the way he pulls off the glove to shake her hand? And he was like, you'd never wear gloves now if you were just taking meat out. What you do is you turn the bag inside out. And as soon as he said it, I was like, how many times have I seen a butcher turning the bag inside out, taking the, you know? That was it. Yeah, there's probably loads of things in it. Yeah.
Tell me about the William Trevor short story, the one that kind of initially nudged you towards the idea of setting stuff in Tramore and stories about Tramore specific.
Yeah. So about 8 years ago, I read a William Trevor short story called Honeymoon in Tramore. Now, Honeymoon in Tramore had been published in the early 60s, I think in New York, not in the New Yorker, but in an American literary magazine. And it's a story about a young fella down in Cork who is in an orphanage, and he's boarded out to a farming family as a teenager. And he falls in love with Kitty, the farmer's daughter, but of course she has no interest in him. But then fast forward about 15 or 20 years, and Kitty gets into trouble, and the fellow wants nothing to do with it, and she's probably in her early 30s at this stage. And Davy Toome, the farmhand, basically is the one who ends up, he's going to marry her. So they go on their honeymoon in Tramore, and that's when he realises the extent of, I suppose, how he's been used, how he's been cuckolded into this. But it's really interesting. At the end of the story, Trevor goes, and he was willing to accept it because he was the one who did better out of this deal. He will inherit the farmland. There's so much in that. I mean, just so much. You know, there's, okay, a story of unrequited love, but of Irish society and of injustice, but then of that epiphany at the end, you know, which Trevor is great for. I mean, it's Joyce, obviously, the master of it, but that moment of epiphany where you realise that actually, you know, there's a kind of pathos at the end of it. But anyway, so the honeymoon in Tramore, I kind of thought to myself, you know, I know Tramore quite well. I mean, when my father died, my mother moved down to Tramore. That's where she lives now. So I spent no time there as a teenager at all. I was there as a young child, and I was there as an adult in my 30s. Nothing in the middle. But I know Tramore quite well now from going up and down over the last 15, 20 years to my mother. I just thought, God, I can't believe William Trevor's the only person who's ever written about this place. There's so much colour in it, it's so visual, it gives so much. And I also had to think, because my mother lives in what we call the top town in the book, that when you, and all the seaside towns have this, they've got the prom, they've got the amusement park, but there's, and people will know it in Kilmore Quay, that behind where the tourists are here during the season, there's all of your community, and your kids go to school together, and you really know this town, the visitors don't. It's all kind of jazz hands for them when they arrive, and it's, you know, but then when the off season, it closes down. It's a very particular kind of atmosphere to, I mean, this isn't a seaside town the way that Tramore is, but I mean, you know, Cortown would be kind of similar, or Bray, or Salt Hill, or Bundoran. Very particular kind of feel to them. I thought, no one has ever done that about Tramore than Trevor, so I'm going to write a couple of stories about Tramore and see how I get on. And that was the first story I published, was a story about a guy in Dublin who gets access to his son for the weekend, court access to his son, and he brings him off on a day trip down to Tramore. It was called A Court Order, and that was shortlisted for the Bath Short Story Prize and was published in the Bath Anthology, and that was the first story I published. And so then I thought, well, geez, that took well, I must be good, you know, because nothing else is getting published. So I wrote another one, and that was, it's the St. Otteran's chapter in this, but it's actually, it was called Visiting Hours, and it won the Harper's Bazaar short story competition. So it was the origin story for the Amusements, and that was the story of Helen going into St. Otteran's which was the lunatic asylum in Waterford City. But it was where alcoholics would be sent to dry out as well in the 80s and the 70s and 80s. And she's going in there to try and get her father out. He's in there drying out to get him out for Christmas, to guilt him into coming home for Christmas.
Given that you're from Tremor,
Yeah.
but you're not from Tremor at the same time, did that make it easier to write this book? Because there's always that thing of, if you had been from Tremor for maybe all of your childhood, maybe into your early 20s, you would know an awful lot more people there. You might feel slightly awkward or difficult about writing about the town itself. But given that you had all of the basis for the town itself, and then had spent, a lot of the rest of your time simply not there, did that make it harder or easier? Was that one of the decisions in, I will be able to do this honestly?
Yeah. I mean, I felt like I could do it honestly in the sense that I got what people call the patois, whatever that is, the vernacular. My aunts and stuff were all South Kilkenny, Waterford, so I got their voices. So I knew that I was kind of doing a reasonable job at that I wouldn't, people can kind of pick holes in it. So I felt like it would be authentic, for want of another word, But I'm not sure that it would ever have put me off. I don't really feel like I'm from anywhere in that sense, because we were in Waterford until I was 8, then we were in Kilkenny until I was 11, then I was in Clondalkin until I was 17, and then I just travelled. I've lived in Dublin now, in the place I lived for the last 23 years. I kind of feel like I'm from Dublin, so I'm not sure that being from a particular place will put you off. It's more that the place that you write about kind of chooses you, that you get inspired by a place. Clondalkin won't come to me, but it's where I feel like I'm from. It just won't. It's not giving me anything. Maybe it will in the future, but I don't think it would stop me at all. A place is really important to me. Place and character are the two most important things to me when I'm writing. And I think if you look at Irish writers in particular, Donal Ryan, it's Tipperary, it's not Nina, but it is Nina. It's always that little, there's a stretch of road somewhere in Nina that his head lives, that. McGahern, it's Coot Hall. Apparently when McGahern showed up to see his stepmother after, the barracks and the dark and all of that, and she was an old woman, his father was long dead, apparently she opened the door to him and said, there you are now, Sean, still making money out of our fibles.
Are you going to read us something from the book?
Yes, but it's not true. Just want to know that.
That's fine, it is fiction. That's okay.
I've always got the wrong glasses with me, so I'll read until it goes blurry. It's like that. And I read from the beginning because I think it kind of just sets the scene, if that's all right. Tremor, population 6,101. It was the off-season and the local youngsters were up to no good in Tip Phelan's caravan park. He wasn't about to begrudge them a few flagons in the dunes until he got a phone call from the Garda sergeant telling him a bad element was hanging around. Would he consider installing security cameras or a couple of Alsatians? That was the way with the guards. They'd make a suggestion, and if you ignored it, you'd be done for tax or speeding or any other shite. The call would have to be acted on, but you were only courting trouble with dogs and cameras, so Tip put a small ad in the Irish Independent instead. Wanted, caretaker to live rent-free by the sea. He was known as Tipperary because the only song he ever sang was Sliabh na Mán. In the back room of the Grand on a Saturday night, nobody would deny he had a voice. There was a want in it that could only be understood by men, since it afflicted them alone, an unassailable scourge for which there was no end or cure. Whenever he cleared his throat to sing, as she up to fuck swept over the bar, hush, 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 all the way down to the lounge, Tip closed his eyes tight against the silence and began. Alone, all alone by the wave-washed strand, and alone in a crowded hall. The hall is as gay and the waves they are grand, but my heart is not here at all. His real name was Michael Phelan, but nobody in Tremor apart from his wife Verona knew it. She called him Tip anyway, and he called her V or VP when they were alone, and she gave him the look, knowing it would drive him demented. They could be at it half the night, and often they were. The next day, he'd be addled with desire and a profound ache in his bones. Early on in the marriage, when he was still hurling, he'd sleep out of Temptation's Way in the spare room, a measure he was forced to take after a bionic all-nighter left him in ribbons for the county final. The sentiment on the sideline was that he'd been brutal and they took him off at half-time. But the match was beyond salvation. OV was lethal all right, or at least she had been until the twins came along. These days she was indifferent to him. It was like living with a cat. When she wasn't changing the babies, she was nursing them, one on each nipple, their little fat legs kneading her stomach like it was dough. She was exhausted, destroyed. He begged her to patch things up with her mother, for the love of God. Verona bundled her breasts back into the sling she'd taken to wearing in place of a bra, zipped her fleece up to the chin. Hell will freeze over, she said, before I talk to that bitch again. 22 people applied for the caretaker job. Tip ruled out 17 immediately on the grounds of age, criminality and Englishness. Of the 5 that remained, 4 hung up when they heard the position was unpaid. The 5th was a musician from Dublin. His accent was thicker than tar. I could do with the headspace. The payphone swallowed another 20 pence from him. Do you know what I mean? Tip knew exactly what he meant. The place is yours, he said. The musician arrived at the weekend with a hold all over his shoulder and a guitar in one hand. The other one he extended in a handshake that was too solid to be sincere, his dark eyes holding Tip's gaze for longer than was necessary. Dahi was his name, and he was idling around the 30 mark, with matted brown hair and the makings of a ginger beard. He wore a hoop in one ear and a scrap of black silk knotted around his throat, an affectation that left itself dangerously open to interpretation. But he had the strut of a man who wouldn't take any lip. They agreed if there was trouble, he was to phone Tip, and if there wasn't, he was to leave him alone. Sorry, that was a bit more ripe than I intended in the church.
Any objections?
Sorry, no, I object.
For those people who haven't read the book yet, I know it's a very big word to call it polyphonic. The idea that you are telling the stories of multiple people at different times, and occasionally people then return at various other points in their lives. It's to all intents and purposes, a series of vignettes and stories, and some people have cameos, some people are there for. That's a tough act to pull off.
Yeah.
What made you go down that route rather than a straight single narrative?
Because I wanted the portrait of the community. The community was at the centre of it, and I wanted to give them voices, and I wanted to kind of take a couple of generations and see how, something that somebody does that is just a small act of cruelty has repercussions for another family years down the line, and how it ends up shaping their lives and how that's perceived by the people who live around them. So it is a story of kind of codependency in a community, and then of course within families themselves being communities, and then breaking down to the individual. So there's this constant struggle in it between what an individual wants and the price of going for that independence, and how you can be shoved out of a family or out of a community because of it, and that's your sacrifice. But also how nurturing the community and the family also are. So there's that push and pull going on all the time. So the only way for me to tell that was to be able to give the people in the community that the 2 main characters, Stella and Helen, that they interact with, was to give them a voice as well, and I just felt that in order to understand what a small town is like, that it needed that sort of diversity of point of view, and polyphonic, so many different voices as well. People talk about whether it's a short story collection or not. Like, I love short stories. They would be really poor short stories. You can't have characters walking into a short story and do nothing. They're there for a reason. Read on, you're going to understand why they're there. So it is kind of this, almost like someone said to me, which I found really flattering. It was like a police procedural where you needed to kind of put people up and go, like that wall of, like a whodunit kind of thing. But the only way I could keep track of it, because the chapters weren't all written in order. They moved around. They moved around an awful lot. I painted my kitchen wall with blackboard paint, and got a big box of chalk, because Post-its, it took me so long to write, the glue was dry and the Post-its were full, and then I'd be like, oh no, it's all falling down, So I started just Venn diagrams and notes in the kitchen, and so the kitchen just had, was like a big blackboard, and that's how I kept track of it, because it was another analogy. The Aaron jumper was the other one I was using. I dropped a stitch somewhere in chapter 1, and I'd have to go back and I'd be like, oh no, they couldn't have happened, because at that stage they weren't living there, or that person was dead, or it doesn't make sense, they wouldn't have met. So you need a biography. When you're going in that deep, you need a biography for every character. I'm telling everyone about the strings and the upholstery here that you don't need to, really know. But it's the scaffolding of it was difficult. I needed to know the story of every character so that they could be somebody who would have been there to interact. But I mean, if the reader knows that when they're reading it, if they see it and I've done a bad job, it needs to be seamless, So that was kind of, it was, there was a lot of structural engineering going on with it that way.
Was there ever a point at which any one character threatened to take over, their voice threatened to become almost too much? I mean, I'm thinking of, for me, it's probably Stella, in that I think there's probably 3 novels in Stella.
Yeah.
Or did you manage to keep them all, I know it's the wrong phrase, in their boxes?
Well, for me, it was Nancy. It was Stella's mother, actually. It's interesting. It's a different person for everyone. They all could have. You'd be getting into, or Ted the Butcher. My God, I love Thaddeus Burke the Butcher. And I think there's more to him, When I got into writing each of the characters, when you're in it, you're like, oh, I love you. I could just be with you forever. And then it's like, I hate you. I can't stand you. Just in this crazy relationship with them. So, any of them could have ended up that way. Well, not any of them, but I think, the 2 main characters, Helen and Stellan's mother, Nancy, and Ted, were the ones that I could have just kept writing over and over. Yeah.
Have you had any reaction from people in Tremor? Have you done any events there?
My first event, actually, no, the first event I did was with you at the UCD Festival.
Oh, wow.
Because the book hadn't come out. Oh, wow. It was the week before the book came out, and that was my first public event. There was a panel of Johnny Dent and who was the other person?
Thank you for just throwing that at me, because
you've done so many.
Year ago.
Yeah, it's more than a year ago.
It is.
But anyway, and at our age, we shouldn't be expected to remember something that didn't happen more than a week ago.
Google that for us. That would be really helpful.
Catherine Pacifica.
Yes. So that's 2 years ago. Yeah.
No.
2 years ago.
It's a year and a couple of months ago.
It
was in June 2022.
June of 22. At least we managed to nail the month, let alone the
because my book was coming out a week later, so I know, Anyway, back to me. So, sure. So that was the first event.
Okay.
But the book hadn't come out. And then I got a message on Twitter from this guy, Derek Flynn, who is a writer down in Tremor. And he said, we'd love if you'd come. We have a writers group that meets every month upstairs in Croke's Pub in Tremor. I didn't grow up there. My family aren't from there, so I don't really know that much about Tremor. I just go to my mum's house and down to the beach and the Amusements and the Chipper. That's what I do in Tremor. So I was like, to the pub and meet people, So I was like, I'd love to do it. So myself and my mum and my son went, and that was my first event, and the place was packed. I nearly died when I walked in. I thought, oh God, if they didn't like it, I'm really in trouble, And my mother isn't able to make quick exits. Like, she takes half an hour to get her down the stairs. I was like, geez, So, but they loved it, and they were really, really kind, and there was a local MEP there. Really,
Derek knows everybody. I know Derek from the Waterford Writers Week.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
He can make rooms filled with people for that kind of
thing. It was packed. It was absolutely packed. Yeah. So that was my first event, and that felt really appropriate, that it was something that was in Tremor. It was just a local thing. It wasn't like a paid festival. You just showed up. It's kind of like a session for writers, and anyone can stand up and read a poem or a bit of local history. And that was the kind of thing that was going on. It was, and then they were like, and now we have this woman with her fancy book. I was like, what? So I was very nervous, but it was good.
Tell me, I wanted to ask you about something else that I'd read you talking about in an interview, your relationship with mobile libraries.
Yeah.
Because I think I might have the same relationship with mobile libraries that you do, in that it was part of my childhood as well.
Where was your mobile library? Was it
Erringall Road in Dremna.
Yeah, because this goes to, I can remember.
This is very niche, by the way, but carry on.
I saw the mobile library pulled up at Sundrive Park on Sundrive Road, which is only around down the road from you, right? Yeah. And I just assumed it had broken down. And then I thought, oh God, I hope nobody robbed it.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
I mean, Dolphin's Barn Library's only down the road, but it's, I love libraries. I wasn't in a library until I moved to Clondalkin. I grew up in Larchville in Waterford. there's a big council estate in Waterford City. I don't know if there's a library anywhere near there now. There must be, because like the new WIG campus is just up the road in the Dublin front. But and then we moved to Kiltown in South Kilkenny, which is really rural, you know. And we were, it was the only estate in Kiltown. It was called the estate. Anyway, we're sitting there, there's maybe 22 little bungalows, you know, in it. And I don't know, we've been living there about a month, and suddenly there was like knocking on the door. There was kids from next door. Everyone was running out. The way kids in your estate with an ice cream truck, it would appear, they'd run out. And there was just this huge bus full of books. I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know that you had to give them back. I didn't know how you got them. I didn't know, you know, and they were just, yeah, so I came away with a load of Enid Blyton and Nancy Drew books and all of that, and it was just like, wow, when are you coming back? It was like once a month, you know, they would, the South Kilkenny or the Kilkenny Library Service would send this bus out, and you'd be just trying to get on that you didn't end up with the Hardy Boys. You'd want the Enid Blytons, you know, nobody wanted to be stuck with that, or Heidi again, you know, this kind of thing. So then we moved to Clondalkin. There's an old Carnegie Library in Clondalkin, and that was where I met my first boyfriend, the photographer for Clondalkin Echo, when I was 12, I think, 13. And we used to go there. You'd say, oh, I'm just going to the library. And she'd say, you can't go to the library. She'd be like, okay. So we'd all go up to the library and sit there writing notes and doing our homework and throwing notes with each other and taking out books. So that was, you know. But one thing I will say is that I grew out of the books really quickly in the library. You know, it was kind of, there was no young adult books when we were young adults. It was Judy Bloom and that was it. And then somebody would get their hands on Flowers in the Attic and you'd be, give it to me, you know, this kind of. So I went on to then reading biographies of musicians and stuff. But it just, yeah, I mean, now you can actually, I think when they're 14, you can get an adult, or there's kind of a young person's reading card. But that definitely was a problem as a teenager, that there just weren't the kind of books that I wanted to read.
Yeah, I went straight into science fiction. Straight from those into science fiction, because there was nothing else in the middle.
Yeah, there is now.
No, there's a world full of them.
Yeah.
What is it like now for you that the book has kind of taken on a life of its own, now that it's out in the real world and doing things and winning things, and people are having their own relationship with it? And, you know, because you've been dealing with that for quite a while now.
It's awful. That's great. Jesus, it's brilliant. Yeah, that's great. I mean, I never thought it would win, you know, big awards, or like, I mean, I have to write the second one now. I mean, I've, you know, 35, 40,000 words into it, but that means nothing, you know. I mean, I expect to have to do 10 or 12 drafts of it. This isn't the first novel I wrote. The first novel I wrote was the one for the Writers' Fair, the novel fair.
Will that never see the light of day?
God, no.
Okay.
No, that's been decommissioned in concrete somewhere, you know. It's gone. No. I took the dog, Buddy, the dog in this was the dog from the first book. And there were a couple of lines and phrases and descriptions of place, you know, that, and so I think there's bits of it that will continue to come out. But so I have to write the third book. So look, it's great. I mean, I'm really fortunate. I couldn't, and it's lovely to read it. I love when I meet people and they've read it and they've got a question about a particular character, you know, and it is sometimes just something very, very small, and you're like, oh, you really did read it.
Because in theory, you're the only person that has that answer, although you may not necessarily have thought about the answer to the question those people have been asking you, in terms of that bit of that character.
Well, I never knew what to ask writers when I met them. I was always too shy to kind of, you know, be the person who put up my hand at a Q&A at the end of an event, or I could never think of a question that sounded intelligent or high-minded enough to ask them, you know.
Put the pressure on this lot for 5 minutes' time. That's lovely.
But no, do you know what it is, though? What I realised is, as a writer, what I love most hearing is when someone makes an observation about, you know, what were you thinking when you did that? Or why did you decide to do that and not this with this character? You know, they're almost treating it like they're real people. Like in that scenario, who was in the right? Who was the most interesting questions are always moral questions about what your characters do. You know, about the decisions they make, because you're the person who made the decision to have them do that. Why did you make that decision? You know, and those are always the most. They're not high kind of, you know, not high-minded stuff. That's not where your head is at when you're writing. You know.
Speaking of which, If anybody has a question that they would like to ask Angela, oh, you are a joy. There is literally one part. Usually, this is the moment when you ask, would anybody like to ask a question? And it's just nothing. It's tumbleweed. What? Oh, over there, you are absolutely fantastic. We will get you a microphone. Hold on for 1 second. You are a joy. Don't care what you're asking. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's just an observation and not a question. Don't care. That's fine. And I can't hear you because you don't have your microphone yet. Hang on. We will get you there. And everybody else.
Have you ever been at those? I was at an event.
Start yourself up.
No, they had loads of money. It was a Sky event, and they had a microphone in a foam cube in the IFI cinema, and they just tossed it into the crowd, and you caught it, and you spoke into this foam cube. It was amazing. Everyone was everyone wanted to talk because everyone wanted
You wanted to go with the cube?
It was around Baz Ashwami.
Okay.
It was the last series of Killing Your Mammy, and they were launching at the IFI, and they had this cube with a microphone hidden in it, a foam cube. Yeah.
Can we make that suggestion for
Yeah,
for phone
Can you
cube?
put that in our rider, please, for next year?
Right. Sorry. So, question over here.
Oh yeah, it's on. So on the description of the event, it said that you were going to discuss your journey and your overnight success, but the overnight success part was in inverted commas. And so I was just interested to hear, what kind of, did you ever feel that it was, you talk about overnight successes and it just appears that you just came out of nowhere and you're such a success now, but about all the failures or all of the difficulties that you had in getting there. I feel like that's sometimes not talked about, and I just was very interested in that part of the description of this event.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was really hard to sell this book because it has an unconventional structure, and that isn't to say I knew the book, the book was well written, but of course it's a business, so publishers want to know that they can sell it, and what you really don't want is for someone to say, oh, well, actually, like I remember the first conversation I had with an agent and a publisher, which would have been the novel fair, and going, but I really love short stories. And it was like I said something really deviant to them. They're like, oh no. Because short stories don't sell. They can't, bookshops, you have to go looking for the short story anthologies and collections. And they don't want short stories. And so this is it. For me, because I had a profile as a journalist, I really didn't want to be going to magazines looking to get published. I wanted to be read blind, where no one knew who I was, because, I was in the Irish Independent, sometimes a couple of times a week with columns. And for myself, I wanted to know that was why I was being published, but also I suppose I didn't want people going, oh yeah, but you were already in the system, So that's how I did it, but there was a lot of rejection, and selling the book was difficult. It was, and the US rights to it haven't sold. So they're still for sale if anyone knows any publishers in America. I think they will sell after the next book, or they might suddenly sell after, winning 2 big prizes. But do you know what's really interesting is that, and I'm going to say who it was because he said it in a public interview, I thought, oh, it's over now. Like I can just, my next novel will be published and it'll be fine. It won't be rejected. I was at an interview or at a public event last year in Nina with Donal Ryan, and he said his publisher had sent him back a novel, and that was how he wrote The Queen of George Island. They just said, this isn't going to work. I nearly had a heart attack. I was like, what? He's such an amazing writer, all the books he's published, all the success he's had, that a publisher can still say to you, I'm not going to publish your book. And I thought, oh my God, how honest of you. Thank you for saying that, because a lot of people wouldn't admit that a publisher had said to them, or an agent had said to them, this isn't going to fly, you have to do something else. So it's full of rejection. Like it is just, you just have to accept it. And I teach creative writing now, and I've been teaching writing for years as the feature writing stuff anyway, so it's not just, that isn't another overnight thing. I have been doing it for a long enough time. But it's when people say they don't want to share their work, or if I'm in a writing group and people go, I don't want to share my work, I couldn't take the criticism, you have to. You just have to take it on the chin. You don't always have to believe it, but you have to listen to what people say. So the rejection is, you need a Kevlar kind of coating on yourself. And that does give you imposter syndrome. That's the problem with it, because you always think, oh no, it's not any good. I keep getting rejections. Do you know what you do? If that's where you are, I think Google, famous rejection letters, and you'll see all the amazing writers and the terrible things that publishers said to them and lived to regret. And the amount of people, who rejected Harry Potter, isn't that
I'm also going to let you into a small secret as well before we do the next question. At events like this, 99% of the time, no one on the stage has ever read the description of the event. We have absolutely no idea what it says. So can I say thank you for filling in that particular gap in my own question asking today, because that's been great. Thank you. Somebody else? Anybody else got the question? Somebody in the centre? Here.
Is that working? Yeah. Your journey was sort of came through local journalism, and obviously that was a real good sort of start point for you. I'm interested in the future of local journalism and local papers. Obviously, is quite dire. What's your view on where young new writers are going to get their training ground? And are you positive about that for the future?
Do you mean journalists, or do you mean?
No, I mean people who kind of train as journalists and grow into writers. I'm interested in, if there is no such thing as local journalism in the future, in the way we know it now, where are those writers going to cut their teeth?
Well, I mean, you would know this as well, right? You know, journalism is full of people who want to be fiction writers, and only a very small minority of them will ever get there. A lot of journalists aren't good writers. They're not good fiction writers, you know, and some of them are. They have the discipline, like they understand that you sit down at the blank screen and you tell the story. So there is that. But I mean, I've got really strong opinions about local journalism and about the syndication of journalism and about how underrepresented regions and giant pockets and swathes of populations are because it's not funded, and that we have an absolutely toothless, sort of system around regulating media and around media ownership. And it's a disgrace. Like, it's an absolute, it horrifies me, and it horrified me as a journalist while I was working for Dennis O'Brien, I might add. But it really, really horrified me what was happening. I saw it time and time again. Once you have one person, and this happens in other countries as well as Ireland, allowed to buy up and own media, then they end up syndicating the journalists' work. The journalists can't work because they used to sell one story that happens, something happens here, it's just something terrible, like there's a fishing tragedy in Kilmore Quay, God forbid, but just an obvious example that you might choose from a town like this. The journalist selling that story, who is on the ground, who will know local people, if something like that happens here, 20 years ago, the journalist would have sold that story to every news outlet in the country and gotten a small fee for it, but it would have ended up being, that's how they make their living. Now what happens is they sell it to one, and that organisation is owned by a parent group and it's syndicated. So there are no regional journalists anymore. And then you look at what's happened in RTE, where they can't get cameramen. I was watching the Culture Night stuff last night on RTE, so you shouldn't have asked me this question. It's really a journalist going to come out.
No, you should.
I was looking at it, and I was saying, like, I was there with my mum watching the end of the news, and we were looking at the quality. She's like, because I don't have a Sky subscription anymore, so I only watch stuff on the player. She's like, geez, you're like someone who's never seen the television the way you're watching that. Why are you peering at it? And I said, I'm trying to figure out who's got a cameraman and who's recording this on a phone. The quality of the stuff, unless you were in Galway, where Theresa Mannion put her foot down and said, get me a cameraman. Unless you're in Dublin and Waterford, they seem to have one, But all of the other stuff, it was all kind of handheld. I was like, is that on a smartphone? How are they even recording it, And that's public service broadcasting. So I really despair for the future of journalism, and I mean really of sort of public accountability in the regions and in the country in general, because of media ownership. It all goes back to that. So, and if I could just say, one of my favourite characters that took about 5 minutes to write in this was Maggie Crowe, the Early Bird Show presenter. She just came into my head. I didn't even have to research her. It was amazing. She just fully formed. Every time someone turned on her radio, there she was.
There's always one.
Yeah.
I can take one more question because we're just about out of time. So there is somebody over here on the right-hand side, right here, down in front of us. Give us a moment and we'll get a microphone to you.
Hi, Angela. I was really interested as you started to read your story. You said something like, this didn't really happen. And that made me think, how much of your inner soul do you have to weave into your fiction? And how do you cope with that exposure?
I think everything is autobiographical in the sense that it comes out of you. The mystery is the shape it takes when it comes out. You're like, oh, that's what it is, you know? I mean, what I mean is that it's totally fictional. There's nobody in my family that's in this. The only thing that actually happened that's in this is when Stella goes into the bar, gets the job in the bar in New York. I did get a job in a bar in New York that's like that. But I'm not Stella. And what happened, you know, in that chapter and in the original story, where that isn't me. But I mean, there's a lot of, there's a huge amount of yourself in it. The things that bother you, they become your preoccupations, you know. So it is the stuff that I think about. The themes are the things that I walk around feeling upset or happy about, or the things that really motivate me. You know, I think all work is autobiographical in that way. The only person that like in Tremor, I did get into a little bit of hot water because there's an Elvis impersonator in this, and there's an Elvis impersonator in Tremor.
Oh.
Every town doesn't have one, apparently. It should. And like years ago, I was in Las Vegas with my mum and my Auntie Peg on holidays, and there was an Elvis convention on there, and there was all of these guys going around, all nationalities and colours, walking around in the suit, you know, at the quiff, the whole thing. And we were like, oh, there has to be an Irish one. So we were there going around, you know, in Flamingo Hilton, walking around looking for the Irish Elvis, and we couldn't find one. So I had this character in my head going, he just couldn't get the money, couldn't raise the money, you know. So I had this character going around in my head, the guy who's trying to get to the Elvis convention in Vegas and doesn't. And so he was Jimmy the King Croke. And then I thought, you know, Tremor, that's where Jimmy the King Croke should be. He should be in this story. And that was fine, so I put him in. And I mean, he's a great character. He's one of my favourites. He's like, what's interesting about him is, it's like he's in cosplay, he's wearing a costume, but he is the most honest and straightforward person in the book. What you see is what you get with him, even though he's dressed up as somebody else, you know? So anyway, fast forward 2 weeks before the book is about to be published, or it must have been earlier than that, the spring, but they've already got the book. And I'm driving into Tremor to my mum's, and the sea fog, which is always there. Out of the sea fog comes this guy with a push bike dressed as Elvis. And I was like, I've lost my mind. I knew, you know.
You've conjured him.
Totally. But he's in a tracksuit. And he's got gold sunglasses on. He's pushing a bike. And I got up and I was like, oh man, listen, I'm just not well. I want to imagine one of the characters, the Elvis impersonator with the bike, and she was going, that's Rocky Mills. I was like, what do you mean? And she said, do you not know him? Everyone knows Rocky Mills. And it says this guy down in Tremor who, and I mean, I must have seen him, like he must have been there somewhere in my head, but I had the Vegas character that I thought up. So thankfully, Jimmy the King Croke is a real hero. Otherwise, I would have had a big problem. Because Rocky Mills is really beloved of the people of not only Tremor, but the whole of County Waterford.
Yeah.
You know? So, yeah, there you go.
Can I say, just before we finish, thank you so much for coming out and for coming to the event, and enjoy the rest of the festival and the events over the next couple of days. Ladies and gentlemen, Aingeala Flannery.